Hello everyone. This is Cognitive Science 501. The title of the course is Algorithmic Structures in Cognition, and at Middle East Technical University Cognitive Science Department. This is the offering in spring of 2020, where we started um, in class teaching. Because of the infamous virus, we continued online. But life goes on, so I'll try to finish the whole course by video recordings. I'm Jen Wolfschein. So this is a course that we offer to our incoming students as a sort of an intensive course for for the appreciation of tools and mechanisms of cognitive science when we study cognitive processes in detail to the point of modeling, including theories that lead to these kinds of models. And this has been a required course for about ever since the beginning of the department in 1997. It has changed a lot over the years, and it has come to the point where I discuss what is structure, what is computation, and why are we dealing so much with computation when we are studying structure. And one nice thing about thinking this way is as you clarify more and more about structure, its computation, its form, its meaning, its uncertainty, and things like this, you'll see that when you begin to tackle how questions, you're going to be closer and closer to modeling these things once the tools and terms of the thing are properly understood. So I'm going to talk about several domains of cognition, like language, vision, planning, but I'm going to be drawing examples mostly from language because that's the easiest way to start. But I'll sprinkle a few examples from language and vision as well. But in the end, we're trying to see how very daunting complexities in cognition that you see can be studied mechanically. The reason why we're studying it mechanically is because mechanical explanation is the one that tries to turn scientific questions into how questions rather than why questions. Of course, how without what is meaningless. So I'm going to be talking about what is it that we're trying to model, but we're not going to stop at that. We're going to try and get to how are we going to do all this rather than just keep talking about it. So so the idea of structure, as you can see, is very important to us because it seems to be all over the processes that we call cognitive. We're going to do it algorithmically in a way that this is the sort of mechanical explanation of this. Once you begin to look at structure from this perspectives, you're going to see that several things that seem to be sort of separate by themselves, when put together, are putting a very demanding task before you. How are you going to put all of that together? So this idea of mechanical explanation goes back to perhaps to essentially Johannes Kepler, and who insisted on coming up for physical phenomena with nothing but causal explanations. And he spent his whole life trying to figure out moving bodies and how they're sort of causally related. And this was culminated by Galileo and Newton by what we call classical mechanics, and then goes on to quantum and others. But the point is, once you have this scientific turn, studying, turning scientific questions rather than looking at them like teleological questions, studying what can be computed and how, or what can be studied and how, not necessarily by computational methods, you're going to see that we have to be very specific about what will be mechanism. And we have to be specific about what is it that that mechanism does. What is it that you're studying? What is that structure? This is the main point of the course, and the way we proceed is essentially is going to look at structure, and structure has some dimensions that you need to do. First looking at independently, and then realizing that they're actually related, you try to put that together, and so we're going to do that step by step. You're going to look at form of the structure, and for that you're going to use formal language theory. We're going to look at meaning of the structure in some representation of meaning, and for that we're going to use lambda calculus. We're going to try and connect these to how question using computation. This is when we talk about automata, because technically speaking, what we call algorithms essentially are automata. Okay, so this is the connecting link to that. Okay, and we're going to do this for syntactic structure, semantic structure, phonological structure, planning structure, visual structure, and things like this. And we're going to try and connect all this to uncertainty, because after all, the world out there contains full of uncertainties, and we seem to be able to cope with it quite well. And the kind of tools that we're going to use for this is called probability theory, which comes in very different varieties, like classical probability theory, von Neumann kind of probabilities, probability as a belief system, probability as a frequency out there in data. So we're going to look at this first and build a vocabulary for formal language theory. I'm going to then move on to lambda calculus and try to give some, flesh into what is it to have some kind of meaning representation. And then we're going to move on to how question, but these are essentially quite descriptive. And we're going to move to how question by saying, all of these seeming independent structures, they're not isomorphic, as we'll see pretty soon. Although they're not isomorphic, they can be studied under the single notion of computation. And that's going to give us automata. At first, automata is going to look a bit like very formal stuff. But once you realize that what we call automata are essentially things in action, like it's like a computer, then this action idea seems very relevant to putting form and meaning together as you take part in life. And of course that's going to take us to uncertainty. And so these are essentially the tools that we'll be building. So these are sort of basics of the tools that you need to be able to build models of structure in cognitive processes. Of course, I'm spending about one third of one or maybe one fourth of the term for each of these. So that's certainly not enough to build realistic models of it, but at least it gives you an appreciation where to look if you end up modeling these things. And it gives you a vocabulary, sort of a lingua franca, where you can go to and talk to people and you know, communicate your ideas in this terminology so that the idea is quite clearly conveyed. So that's the purpose of the course. So what is this thing that we call structure? That's the first way to start. Now, to appreciate the idea of structure, you need to maybe put it in contrast with content. So, well, obviously related, they are related, but how do we make the connection is the critical question. Now the thing is usually content can be quite ambiguous. Take a word like man. Well, that sounds like a noun, but I can also say we manned the aircraft with interns rather than professionals. So that's when you put, so man is essentially ambiguous between an event reading versus an object reading. Now the structure itself is not ambiguous. So we have to be specific about what does it mean to be ambiguous. What does ambiguity mean? So this is the purpose of the course. We're going to be very specific about what does it mean to be ambiguous. So it seems like when you fix the structure of the thing, there seems to be less ambiguity. So if you say that the man, the meaning of this is essentially moving towards an object interpretation. And here's the first structural sign that says, well, it's the structure doing this for you. This is sometimes called a functional element or like a determiner. And when you do that, this man has no longer an eventive reading, but some kind of a definite description of somebody. But if you say, we manned the aircraft, with interns, let's say. So again, you see structure here, right here. So this is the event interpretation of man, and this is the sort of definite description interpretation of man. It's always introduced by some functional element that seems to be coming from structural properties. The point is here, what is it that sort of allows you to avoid the eventive interpretation? And here, what is it that allows you to avoid the different description interpretation, and you move toward the predicate interpretation of man? So the idea is, although the content of man is ambiguous, when you put structure on it, this is disambiguated by the structure. Now, this disambiguation itself is is a bit funny. It has its limits. For instance, you can say, I saw the man with a telescope. Well, this has two readings, at least two readings in English, where I have the telescope and I do the seeing with the telescope. But if I say I saw the man with the telescope, I'm moving towards the case where I am doing the seeing and the man has a telescope. Okay? And you might be thinking, well, yeah, this has structure, and you just said that structures are unambiguous. Well, this is ambiguous. Well, this is sometimes called structural ambiguity. That does not mean that a given structure is ambiguous. It just means there are different ways of interpreting the structure. Okay? So as we sort of try and cope with the uncertainty and in content by adding structure onto it, it's not going to give you structural determinism for free. You still have structural ambiguity that you need to sort of triangulate against the real world to be able to say, well, in this context, when you say something like this, I think you have a telescope, or something like that. Okay, so these kinds of ambiguities, just because you have ambiguity here doesn't mean you don't have structure. It just means that there are different ways of interpreting the structure, and you have to be very specific about how you're doing this. Okay? So one way to do that is very specific about two alternative structures here. And this is called essentially grammar. Okay, so I take the grammar as a technical term, not the high school stuff, but this is the grammar as a mental object that allows you to discern two different interpretations of that given different contexts. Okay, so this is going to tie up to grammar in a technical sense. And you have to be very specific about what do you mean by a technical sense. Okay, what does it mean for a mental object? I mean, I'm saying this is a mental object. What does it mean for a mental object to be, well specified, well represented, and how does it tell me the difference between two different interpretations of this? So that's why we have to be very specific about forms and meanings and other stuff in the structure. Okay. So this is one thing about structure. And when you look at structure, not just from language, but also from other cognitive domains, you're going to see a lot of ambiguities as well. So my way of showing this is I'm a bit of a one-trick pony, so I do everything on the board. I can't do slides and board at the same time. I'm not very multimodal at all. So I'm going to show you some figures in the video because you can't upload PDFs to YouTube. So I'm going to show you some stuff, and I'm going to try and give you an appreciation of what's going on in this. So here's, just take a look at this figure. Okay. Well, this is a drawing in 2D on a piece of paper, but your mind immediately conjures up a 3D object, right? Now, here is something related to that. But that's also a 2D figure, and you're having difficulty conjuring up a 3D image. One of the famous cognitive scientists, David Marr, said, Well, our mind is incredibly capable of going from 2D to 3D, from simple drawings like this into imagining some kind of an object. And he said the way it does it is having a 2.5D representation of what's going on. So what was he getting at? Well, they have courses on vision and they're going to talk about more endlessly, but I'm going to tell you what he's trying to get at. Basically, when you look at this figure, certain parts are doing okay, but sort of this this part is a bit funny, right? And this part is a bit funny. And that's why your mind is having difficulty connecting things to conjure up a 3D image. So the idea of looking at these kinds of problems structurally, it says, well, yes, this is actually a very local computational problem that your mind is solving. And believe it or not, it's solving it using certain properties of objects, essentially 4 primitives. That's what he suggested. Along with David Waltz and others, said, well, these are the things that these are the ways your mind conjures up edges, convex edges, concave edges, and things like this. And out of these 4 properties, if you take these possibilities of combination of these things and map it onto the objects that I've shown you, this is going to come out as ill-formed, and this is going to come out as well-formed. Okay, so well-formedness of a structure, given its primitives like this, is a very critical question to us, because your mind is capable of doing that, and we're trying to understand how it's done. And you probably know these optical illusions. I mean, just take a look at this classic. Well, yes, right. Depending on how you interpret it, you can see a ways or 2 people, or maybe more. And that's so. You might think, well, that looks a bit like the structural ambiguity that I talked about. This is ambiguous, unlike the previous example that I showed you. This is ambiguous in the sense that there are 2 legitimate interpretations, at least 2 legitimate interpretations of what I'm showing you. But given the interpretation, if you think this is a race, then you've got a deterministic interpretation. Or given 2 individuals, you've got a fixed interpretation. So how do we do this fixing? That's the critical question. and you can, and just sticking with vision, if you just take these 2 objects, I mean, these are 2 chalks. Let me just keep one here and one here. Now, how do you know these are similar kinds of objects? The light conditions of this is quite different than the light conditions of that. But besides all that differences, metrical differences that you see, you sort of get a sensation that these are similar kinds of objects. They are solid. How do I know it's solid? And things like this. So these are essentially, I mean, how do we sort of filter out essential properties, sort of zoom in on the essential properties of certain things to say when the thing is moving, for instance, what moves is still the same stuff. It doesn't disintegrate when I do that. So things like these are very, sort of simple questions that you probably haven't thought of before, but this is the bread and butter of doing cognitive science. How is your mind doing all this? Okay. So one suggestion is doing a lot of multiple structures at the same time and putting things together, given your life training, of course. You're not born recognizing all these things. So you're sort of build these knowledge as you grow up. So what is it that you're building is the critical question. So for structure, it turns out to be in the form of a grammar. So you can talk about grammar of languages, obviously. That's where the term comes from. You can also talk about grammar of vision. You can talk about grammar of buildings. You can talk about grammar of plans. For instance, if you think in terms of planning, and if you're thinking of going from, let's say, from Ankara to Istanbul, and then say you buy a ticket, well, what is it ticket of? Is it a ticket for the flight? Is it a ticket for the shuttle? Are you going to the airport, or are you in the are you at the airport flying to Istanbul? So you need to disambiguate these things. But these things have structure, right? I mean, one way to go to Istanbul is going in a very organized way. Organize your stuff, buy your ticket, plane ticket, uh, get yourself organized to be at the airport at the proper time. So you take the shuttle or the metro, and then you go there, but you don't go to the airport just for lunch or dinner. People usually don't do that. I mean, going to the airport has a certain function. Of course, you can have lunch at the airport. That's not what you're there for. But how do you know that somebody says, okay, so you bought a ticket, and says, well, I'll see you at Istanbul tomorrow. Well, how does he know that you're not going to the airport for lunch? Right? But because these kinds of plannings, organized behavior, has certain expectation-driven value. Right? I'm doing this for something, and I'm building up my structure bit by bit so that you can predict what I'm trying to do if I allow you to do so to speak. And if I show some overt behavior to allow you to make these inferences, then you can make these inferences. But that's quite an inference, right? I mean, it's quite a leap somebody saying, I bought a ticket to Istanbul, and somebody says, okay, I'll see you. Maybe if you go to lunch at Istanbul or something. That's quite a number of inferences that goes through it to understand this exchange. So you can see structure in language as well. For instance, and the interesting part about linguistic structure is they seem to come at levels. So you can talk about to use the linguistic terminology, you can talk about syntax, how surface expressions are organized. You can talk about semantics. What does that organization mean? What are the building blocks of that? Things like this. You can talk about phonology. Your overt behavior itself. You utter something or you sign it in a sign language. The difference of language doing in this from like a gesture is that gesture is not very easy to organize, to explain complex ideas. I mean, you can say I'll see you tomorrow. You can gesture I see you tomorrow. You can gesture like I saw the man with the telescope, by pointing and do these things if it is nearby. But try and do that for like this is the man I think you claim made lives. So this is the thing about linguistic structure. It can be, it's going to have its own structure within structure within structure, and can keep doing this, and end up conveying very complex ideas. So in that sense, there is this notion of almost endless capacity to be able to, build structure on top of other structure. Now, the idea of computation says, well, you're doing this in a very resource-sensitive way. You're building structure bit by bit rather than exponentially building up something at once. And this is where computation can help you understand what does it mean to have this notion of locality, of building the structure. And that's why we're going to study these things closely. There's also structure of words that you need to worry about. So manned, this is a past tense, at least in English, and for this particular word, if you pluralize it, you're not talking about the event, you're talking about several men. Okay? And of course, this is not the way you always do it. So book is books, and this is sometimes called the regular plural. But anybody with knowledge of English will say this is plural, and so is this one. And morphology is trying to figure out this stuff. And you might be thinking, well, why do we study these things in several dimensions? Because it seems to us that the nature seems to be coming to us at levels. This is a famous quote from Herbert Simon, who's a Nobel laureate. He received a Nobel Prize in economics, but if you look at the work for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize, it's actually computer science and cognitive science. He tried to explain people's bounded rationality in building up organizations and how the limits of this can be seen in the complexity of organized behavior. And he got a Nobel Prize for that. So what does it mean by studying nature at levels, because it comes to us as levels? Well, very simple demonstration of this from Turkish. Take this word kiler, right? Now, this means seller in Turkish, and it's not plural, which is a bit funny because when you say evler, which is houses, this is plural. That's the Turkish plural. But if you look at the surface form, they are the same, but you know that this is not the plural, this one is the plural. Okay? So phonologically speaking, in one sense, this is what's called the meaning-bearing element. It's a morpheme. Okay? And this is not a morpheme, apparently. But not anymore. Maybe it was some years ago, but not anymore. And you can say, okay, the only relevant part of this is for things like this is morphology, and I can forget the rest. And for that, you can say, well, the only relevant part for that is the lexicon. Maybe add another thing here. Well, this is a lexical item, so I'm going to start worrying about it, about its morphology. It's just a lexical item. Okay? But, I mean, here's another example. When you say evlere, let me gloss it like linguist. This is like house, plural, dative case. Dative case is like ehali in Turkish. And the interpretation here is that this is the root, this is the plural morpheme, and this is the dative morpheme. But if you look at its phonology, for instance, its syllable structure is about phonology. So I said it like evler, evle, red. Okay? So this is the syllable structure. If you look at syllable structure, you're not going to see the morpheme all the time. Okay? And this is not a dative. So that's why looking at same thing from different perspective gives you different dimensions of the complexity of the problem. Okay? And you can do the same thing with syntax and semantics distinction. You can say, I go home, eve gidiyorum, with a dative. But you can also say, ev yanıyor, the house is burning. So ev is essentially can give you different kinds of roles depending on how you organize the things around ev. All right, that's why syntax and semantics not always coincide anyway. So instead of saying, well, only in certain cases they don't overlap, in many cases they do, and doing the same thing, like, well, phonology is 90% morphology, because after all, there are cases where the morphemes and the syllables overlap. So if you say evlerde, this is house, plural, and locative. And if you look at the syllables, they are just like the morpheme boundaries. But the fact that you can do this shows that your phonological knowledge and your morphological knowledge are distinct in your mind anyway. Okay? Okay? So this is the critical thing about structure. It's got multiple dimensions, multiple modalities, and we need to study them at various levels, because it comes to us at various levels. And one very sort of significant distinction between syntax and semantics I can exemplify from I guess for easiest example from English. You can say, I persuaded or promised or expected Mary to study. Right? And this is, so you can look at this problem very syntactically. Say, well, the surface structure of this is pretty much the same. A subject followed by a verb, either persuade, promise, or expect, followed by Mary to study. So the surface structure, the syntax is pretty much the same, but when you use persuade, if the expression is I persuaded Mary to study, Mary is studying. Okay? If you say I promised Mary to study, I am doing the studying. And when you say I expected Mary to study, again, Mary does the study. And you can say, yeah, you see, these things are the same. So the syntax and semantics, with a few exceptions, can be the same. But here's the interesting part. When you say I persuaded Mary to study, Mary is persuaded. So Mary is an argument of persuade. Okay? When you say I promised Mary to study, it it's still a debate in linguistics whether marry is an argument or persuade. But it's no question about expect. When you say I expected Mary to study, I'm not expecting Mary. I'm expecting Mary to study. So Mary is not an argument of expect. Okay? So these things, although the surface structure, the syntax of this looks pretty much the same, and you can say, well, the study is sort of narrowed down to just two options. So I'll take this as sort of an outlier or something like this. Then when you begin to see more differences, well, this is an argument of persuade. This is the argument of that is a bit questionable. This is not an argument of that. Then you begin to see that semantics is not really equal to syntax. Okay, so you have to do something about that, because when I say I expected Mary to study, I don't want to get the meaning that I would get with persuade. I want to get something else to show proper understanding of the problem I'm studying. Okay, so this is the critical thing, and this is what we're going to be looking at in this course, and that's why we need to be very specific about syntactic structure, how it can be disambiguated given a certain reading, and then we have to be specific about, well, okay, given the structure, and you say there's a certain meaning, but how do I get that meaning is the second question. And the third question is, okay, I'm doing all this, but I'm doing this under the presence of uncertainty in certain cases, like I saw the man with the telescope example. How do I resolve the ambiguity is the third question. And the fourth question is, of course, well, yes, but I seem to be doing this as I go. It's not like, let's do syntax first, let's do semantics, can you please talk to each other? Instead of that, you're doing it on the fly without noticing. How can I combine all of these to go and give me the proper interpretation given proper circumstances? So that's essentially, computation is going to bring all of this into interpreting everything as you go. And this is sort of the bond between these multiple structures doing their own stuff, but only at a lockstep with each other, to the point that when you're seeing an expression like this, you don't have to wait to the end of the sentence to figure out who's doing what to whom. You already know by the time you're here what are the circumstances that we're dealing with. Okay, how do we do that? Is the computational question. That's the argument. So we're going to do this, and the interesting part about these structures is that it seems to be unlimited in some sense. Let me again give you a sort of a very simple example from language. I'm going to take 4 words of English. And I'm going to generate infinitely many English sentences out of that. I can say, I like you. I can say, I think I like you. I can say, I think you think I like you. And you can say, I think you think I like you, or things like this. So you know where this is going. So you can look. I'm staying within the domains of these are all well-formed English sentences. You may be having difficulty to figure out who is doing what to whom after a while, but given enough context to interpret these things, you'll be interpreting them on the spot like this. And this is what we're trying to understand. How are you doing this? Almost like a reflex. Okay. And same thing with vision. I mean, I showed you, I showed you this, and you immediately said, well, there's a problem here. And what allows you to do that is the topic of this course. Okay? So the problem is everywhere in cognition. So in principle, this is essentially unlimited, and that's why you seem to be able to cope with any kind of complexity that's thrown at you in life. With the limits, of course, but you know. So this incredible capacity to add more and more complex structures without complicating the mechanism is the critical question. So that's the thing. Let me end this introduction with that. We're looking at, as you can see, we're looking at very complex behavior. So we have behavior on one side, and we have mechanisms on the other. And these can be simple and complex, right? A mechanism can be simple, a mechanism can be complex. A complex mechanism is something like, it's the kind of mechanism that you can disentangle into components. Either it's too big to be disentangled, or it's just too intertwined and entangled to be disentangled. Simple means, you know, you got your modules and everything is building up from very simple primitives. So in that sense, it will be simple. Behavior can be simple and complex as well. And if you're looking at this connection, I want to study simple behavior using simple mechanisms, you probably don't need this course. Because, as you can see, the kind of stuff that we face in cognition are complex. Okay? And you can say, okay, I can try this. I'm going to study complex behavior. I'm going to do it with very complex mechanisms, but that's not the business of science, right? I mean, in science, when you have a theory, your theory is not as complex as your data. You compress the theory. I mean, just imagine this. If my theory of physics is all the particles in the universe, well, my theory of physics is as big as the universe itself, the thing that's trying to explain. So that doesn't really count like as a theory. So this is not really what we're getting at. This is certainly we're not interested in. And this is also a bit questionable. I mean, if I want to study very simple behavior, and I'm going to do it in a very complex way, but is the simple behavior really worth it? I mean, after all, my data is known to be not simple. So what is it that I'm trying to get by proposing very complex mechanisms? And recall that I'm using the word mechanism as a thing that answers the how question, rather than, you know, just so bells and whistles and you know, cranks going up and down. I don't mean that. I mean as looking at the how question. So the real interesting connection here is that this one, can we study complex behavior using very simple mechanisms? I showed you very complex behavior in vision, planning, and language. And I'm implicitly suggesting that when you look at all these from the point of computation, which is known to be a simple mechanism, then if you can computationally capture this complex behavior using simple mechanism, in other words, as the complexity of problem grows, your mechanism does not get equally complex. It just stays simple, so that if you want to, you know, tweak and fiddle with it, you can go out and find the same principles operating. So this is what computation gives you, studying complex behavior using very simple mechanisms. Other things can give you that too. The reason why computational modeling and computational theorizing is so common is because it's a computational model, and because I know the terms of the computer, I can change the model to make predictions, to make discoveries, to make things like this. Okay? So that's the whole point of using computation, at least from my perspective. So I'm using computation simplicity as a scientific tool to explain some empirical phenomena. Now, for you to be able to do that, you have to be very clear about the terms of computing. What does it mean to be a computer? How does a computer compute? Over what kind of representation computing takes place? Things like this. What is it that is computing? Is it syntax? Is it semantics? Is what? These, you have to be very clear about these terms. Okay, so in that sense, computer science has two phases. One is to understand the resources of computers, so the internal view of computer science. And once you understand the computers and computer science in proper terms, you turn your head to nature and say, okay, with this simplicity, I'm ready to tackle some complex behavior. Now, here you're going to see lots of different perspectives. Some people take that to mean building artificial agents, building artificial intelligent things, because if you're modeling very complex behavior using simple, maybe the model itself is conscious and things like this. This is a very big discussion in AI. I'm not going to get into that because I'm not doing that kind of science. I'm saying I'm using computers to explain complex behavior in cognition. Okay, that doesn't necessarily make the model itself a human being, an artificial agent, a sentient being, or whatever. I'm trying to explain complex behavior using simple mechanisms. Okay? So I'll try and see how far we can go with this, and I'll start with formal structure, starting with next lecture, and I'm going to be very specific about what does it mean to be an explicit description. But descriptions are not computations, so I'm going to clarify what's a description, and I'm going to add a bit of automata, use of a description in action, using automata theory, and I'll go to meaning and uncertainty, and try and make this connection as explicit as possible. Okay, so that's it for the introduction, and I'll see you next week with some basic elements of studying formal structures. Okay, see you soon.